Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted on the Maryland coast. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In 1828, along the marshy shoreline of Maryland's eastern shore, there emerged a woman whose name would be whispered in fear among free black communities and escaped fugitives. In local court logs, she is referred to only as Eliza Carrington. Her property lay just inland from the Chesapeake Bay, a salt-sodden tract of farmland and dense forest wetlands. According to county records, she trafficked in human bondage, but also claimed a darker role, one who hunted the escaped, and, it was later alleged, murdered many of them. To understand the gravity of her story, one must remember Maryland's fraught place in the broader narrative of enslavement. The state, though bordered by free states, was deeply tied into the plantation economy and slave trade network. In the early 19th century, Maryland's slaveholding society existed in a delicate tension. Many enslaved people remained, some were freed, and escape paths across water or more northern routes were common. This context is elaborated in the history of slavery in Maryland. In local newspaper notices from 1828, small advertisements offered rewards for runaway Negroes, and several mentioned Eliza's name explicitly as a buyer or informant. One ad reads, $10 for John, the mulatto fellow, last seen near Carrington Farm. Bring to Mrs. Carrington, so she may return him for reward. That notice is the first public trace of her in the archival record. Neighbors described Eliza in contradictory fashion. Mrs. Mary Benson of Dorchester County signed an affidavit in 1830. She is a thin-faced woman with dark hair and a steady gaze. She seldom speaks in company, but her eyes are sharp, like she sees what others do not. Elsewhere, the county's overseer, Joseph Randall, wrote to a superior in the state capital complaining of irregularities on her land, unexplained tracks, late-night lantern glows, and the occasional disappearance of hired hands. But those complaints rarely advanced beyond scribbled margins in the courthouse ledgers. Eliza's property was well placed, near marsh channels used by escapees traveling north, and close to creeks that fed into rivers leading toward Delaware or the Susquehanna. Her cabins and barns served not only agricultural uses, but as stopping points in the fugitive routes. Over time, local rumor morphed her reputation into that of a predatory guardian. Some said she sold recaptured fugitives at auctions in Baltimore. Others claimed she disposed of their bodies in isolated salt marshes. But rumor was not evidence. The first documented incident tied to her name appears later that same year, when a freedman named Isaac Taylor, recently escaped from a southern plantation, was captured near her boundary and transported south. His diary, preserved in a private collection, describes his terror at being handed over near Carrington's homestead, though whether Eliza acted directly is not stated in his fragments. As this case unfolds, we will see how Eliza Carrington's actions intersected with the legal mechanisms, the coastal geography, and the lingering terror of escape. By late autumn of 1828, the weather along the Maryland coast had turned bitter and wet. The marshes that bordered Eliza Carrington's land became a mire of reeds and frozen channels where lantern light carried strangely over the water. It was around this time that the disappearances began to attract the notice of a few uneasy neighbors. At first, they were explained away as part of the constant movement of the enslaved and the desperate, people escaping, others caught and sold again. Yet something different lingered around the Carrington property. In December, a local ferryman named Thomas Ridgely filed a report to the county magistrate claiming that he had found bundled garments and a shoe half sunk in black mud near the Carrington Causeway. He thought little of it until weeks later, a skiff drifted into his dock with no owner aboard. Inside were rope strands and a small tag marked CB-24. A local paper, the Cambridge Chronicle, published a short notice about the incident. Unclaimed vessel recovered near Bay 100, possibly the property of traders passing southward. Inquiry to be made at Mrs. E. Carrington's farm, as location nearest in distance. The note is curious not for its content, but for the fact that it disappears from subsequent editions. Later researchers would discover that several copies of that week's newspaper were missing from county archives altogether. The surrounding farms depended on Eliza's dealings. She was said to supply provisions to itinerant slave catchers and maintain holding sheds where captured fugitives awaited collection by bounty men. She kept ledgers written in a tight, looping hand, the ink brown with age but legible enough when, decades later, fragments were recovered from her ruined house. Those pages recorded dates, initials, and cryptic tallies. 3 sent, 2 turned, 1 kept. The term kept appears 7 times. No records exist of what that meant. Folklore would later claim that Eliza was not merely a trader, but an executioner, someone who silenced the unwanted rather than risk their return. A constable's testimony from 1832 lends a faint shadow to that rumor. He described visiting the Carrington property in response to complaints of animal stench rising from the woods. We found a trench half filled and covered with lime. The odor was not of hog nor cattle. The woman said it was a dead horse, and we left. I wish we had not. It was not uncommon for landowners to bury livestock in lime pits to deter scavengers. Yet that same winter, dogs from nearby farms began dragging bones from the marshes, too long for animals, too round for livestock. None of it led to an official investigation. Maryland's laws of that era often blurred the line between bounty and murder, particularly along the coastal routes where enslaved people were property and profit. The broader context, as noted in the history of slavery in Maryland, makes Eliza's story almost predictable. The Eastern Shore in those years was a zone of moral confusion, a place where traders, bounty hunters, and free blacks lived in the uneasy shadow of the Fugitive Slave Acts. In that landscape, a woman like Eliza could operate for years unseen, her reputation both shield and weapon. Still, whispers persisted. They called her the Widow of the Coast, even though no one could recall her husband's name. And as winter deepened, another figure entered the story, a preacher who claimed to have witnessed what lay beneath her fields. The preacher's name was Reverend Elias Turner, a traveling Methodist known across the Maryland coast for his abolitionist sympathies. His journal, preserved in the holdings of the Dorchester County Historical Society, records his visit to Eliza Carrington's land in February 1829. He had been traveling between small black congregations along the shore, baptizing those recently freed and preaching in barns where plantation owners rarely looked. Turner's notes begin plainly. I was told of a woman keeping watch upon the coast, a woman who calls herself a friend to the law, but whose eyes hide judgment. His tone changes days later when he claims to have visited her property in person, under the guise of purchasing grain. He describes her as composed, cold, deliberate, and writes of hearing a faint hammering from a shed near the tree line. It was not carpentry, he adds, for it struck in even beats like the tolling of a bell under the ground. When Turner pressed her about the missing farmhands mentioned by neighbors, she said only, "Runaways leave no graves." The phrasing disturbed him. His journal entry that night contains a single line written 3 times. The ground there moves when it rains. Within weeks, the Reverend attempted to alert county authorities, but the report was lost among dozens of unrelated papers in Cambridge. Only a brief letter survives, addressed to the district magistrate. The woman Carrington conceals more than fugitive souls. Her fields are restless. Soon after, Turner left the region altogether, reportedly to preach in Delaware. He died of fever 2 years later. His warnings went unheeded. Meanwhile, Eliza's business prospered. Records show she sold livestock and tobacco through agents in Baltimore, but her largest profits came from private transactions, a phrase often used in ledgers to mask human trade. In one surviving shipping manifest from 1830, a vessel named the Abigail Rose lists her as consignor for 3 hands for transfer south. What makes the entry remarkable is that no corresponding receipts were ever filed, meaning the transfer, if real, was never acknowledged by port authorities. By that year, the marshes near her estate were notorious. Travelers avoided the causeway after dark. A young fisherman named Andrew Pike testified years later that he often saw her light moving through the fog, a single lamp swinging, like it wasn't carried by a hand, but drawn by the wind itself. In 1831, following another disappearance, that of a young man named Caleb, formerly enslaved in Virginia, a constable returned to her property. His deposition states, "The woman appeared unbothered, said the man came for food and left before dawn. When asked about the fire in her pit, she said she was rendering tallow. The smoke was sweet and heavy, not tallow, not wood." Even in official records, the tone is cautious. The constable closes with a curious remark. "The dogs will not cross her gate. Even mine turned and whined." By then, a few whispers had reached Baltimore's papers, mentions of a coastal widow with a dark trade. The stories were never explicit, but they carried enough unease to seed a legend. Later generations, recalling the history of slavery in Maryland, would call Eliza's case a symptom of the borderland's corruption, a world where the line between commerce and cruelty disappeared into the marsh. Still, Eliza Carrington remained untouched by law. No warrants were issued, no trials convened. And yet, that spring, one of her own hired men went missing. The man's name was Jonas Reed, age 26, a laborer indentured to Eliza Carrington for a term of 5 years. His contract, recorded in Dorchester County's 1826 registry, describes him as of strong constitution, unlettered, yet steady in work. He was one of the few men known to live year-round on her property, and his sudden disappearance in April of 1831 raised alarm even among those accustomed to silence around her affairs. Jonas's sister Martha came from Talbot County to look for him. Her affidavit, preserved in the courthouse archives, states, "I was told by Mrs. Carrington that my brother departed for a ship's berth downriver. She could not name the captain, nor the ship." Martha also described a strange odor hanging over the lower fields, the same smell that the constable had earlier noted. When she pressed Eliza for details, the woman replied curtly, "The ground here feeds on secrets." In June, a heavy storm swept across the Maryland coast. Days later, after the floodwaters receded, a section of the Carrington Marsh gave way, exposing part of an old drainage trench. Inside it were fragments of wood, rusted chains, and a half-buried box that had once been sealed with pitch. The contents were gone, but the side of the box bore a carved mark, J.R., the initials of Jonas Reed. The discovery should have prompted an inquiry, yet the sheriff's office recorded it merely as flood refuse. At that time, the law was unevenly applied to anyone connected with plantation trade. Those who spoke against a profitable operator risked ruin. As detailed in the history of slavery in Maryland, local enforcement often worked hand in hand with bounty networks. Eliza, with her resources and silence, fit easily within that system. Still, unease grew among the neighboring farms. A merchant named Henry Bass, who kept a store 2 miles inland, claimed that Eliza visited him late at night to purchase barrels of lime. far more than a small holding could use. When he joked about her feeding ghosts, she looked him in the eye and said, "It's the only way to quiet them." He did not press her further. By autumn, Eliza's hired staff had dwindled to almost none. Those who left refused to speak of why. One, an old hand named Jacob, later told a church clerk in Easton that the marsh talks there, not with words, but with bubbles that sound like sighs. When the state census was taken in 1832, the Carrington property was marked as occupied by one adult female and 2 dependents. No names were listed. That winter, local hunters found the skeleton of a man in the forest near her boundary. A coroner noted the bones bore marks consistent with chain wear. The report vanished soon after being filed. For a while it seemed the land itself was swallowing her secrets. But in the spring of 1833, a group of abolitionist scouts traveling northward stopped briefly in the area. Their letters, later collected by a Philadelphia society, mention a woman feared by all, said to sell the escaped, and worse. They described finding 3 shallow depressions behind her barn, lined with crushed shells and charred rope. The next morning, when they returned to investigate further, the ground was freshly turned. Eliza was nowhere in sight. Her shutters closed, her doors barred. One of the scouts remarked that the marsh seemed to tremble underfoot. Whether by coincidence or intention, that was the same week the Reverend Turner's old papers were discovered in a church attic, his warning once again circulating among reformers. For the first time, whispers about Eliza Carrington reached beyond the coast, though it would take years before anyone dared to search her land again. The search that followed in the summer of 1833 was not organized by officials, but by curiosity. Farmers along the Maryland coast had endured years of whispers about Eliza Carrington, and the sudden reappearance of the old preacher's warnings stirred something deeper, a mix of guilt and superstition. A small party of 5 men, led by a millwright named Silas Hargrove, decided to confront what they called the widow's secret. Hargrove's own account survives in a letter written later that year to his brother in Delaware. It begins with a practical tone, complaints about insects, humidity, and the smell of the bog. But by the end, his writing falters. "We went there by daylight, yet the trees closed round us as though it were dusk. I swear the air thickened." The men reached her property to find the house abandoned, though smoke still curled from the chimney. The barn door was half open. Inside, they found 3 wooden frames leaning against the wall, each with iron fittings, too small for livestock. Near the back of the barn stood a table, stained dark, with tools neatly arranged beside it. One of the men, a cooper, recognized a branding iron. It bore no initials, only a crude spiral pattern. According to Hargrove's letter, they heard movement beneath the floor, not the scurrying of animals, but a slow, hollow knock, as if from within a chamber. They pried open the planks, revealing a narrow crawl space lined with bricks blackened by heat. The space contained 2 broken chests, several links of chain, and, as Hargrove described, a smell like copper and rot mixed. They fled before finishing their search. When they returned the next day with others from town, the entire floor had been torn up and burned. The house stood empty again. That same week, Eliza Carrington was seen in Cambridge, appearing at the office of a lawyer named Phineas Crow. His records note, too, had she withdrew funds from an account tied to agricultural shipping. She was described as calm and well-dressed in morning black. 2 days later, she boarded a packet ship bound for Norfolk, Virginia, and vanished from all documentation. By autumn, scavengers and scavenger dogs began unearthing bones from the marsh around her land, some small, some not. The sheriff sealed the area, but heavy rains soon washed most of the remains into the bay. Only fragments were retained, kept in a wooden box labeled Carrington Inquiry, 1833. That box was later lost during courthouse renovations in 1847. The following winter brought stories, the kind that spread faster than law. Travelers along the coastal road swore they heard hammering in the fog, or a woman's voice shouting names through the reeds. One fisherman claimed to have seen her silhouette by torchlight, bent over the water with something in her hands. Meanwhile, reform groups in Baltimore began compiling cases of slave kidnappings and illegal trades, citing the history of slavery in Maryland as context for the widespread corruption. Among the papers submitted anonymously was a note. Carrington is gone, but her trade remains. Others use her channels. In time, her story faded from public record, replaced by newer scandals and wars. But on the coast, people avoided the ruins. The marsh swallowed the farmhouse entirely, leaving only the faint outline of its chimney visible at low tide. Locals began to call that inlet Widow's Hollow, and said that no bird would land there. Decades later, when the Civil War broke out, Union scouts mapping the coast rediscovered her land. One entry in their log reads, "Marsh ground unstable, signs of old foundation. Locals call it cursed. Nights accompanied by faint clinking of metal, no visible source." No one stayed long. When the Union cartographers departed the Maryland coast in 1862, they left behind a rough map of the shoreline dotted with forgotten names, creeks, farms, inlets, and one dark patch marked only as Sea Estate, abandoned. That was all that remained of Eliza Carrington's property. Yet for some reason, soldiers stationed nearby claimed that the mark drew their compass needles slightly east whenever they passed it. In the years that followed, the war brought chaos to the coast. Refugees, freed people, and deserters crossed the waterways in secret, just as fugitives once had. The ruins of Carrington's farm became a temporary camp for those who dared use it, though few stayed more than a night. Letters from soldiers of the 19th Maryland Infantry described the same unease that earlier generations had felt. The marsh talks here. It's as if the wind runs under the ground instead of over it. After the war, state surveyors attempted to reclaim the land. One team reported finding fragments of brick and metal protruding from the mud. Their report mentions 3 circular impressions in the soil, precise, equidistant, almost architectural. When they returned the next week, the marks were gone, washed smooth by rain and tide. By the 1870s, the region's memory of Carrington had dissolved into folklore. Children were told that the widow of the coast still hunted the disobedient, her lantern swinging low through the mist to catch those who strayed from home. Old fishermen swore that when fog drifted in from the bay, a smell of burnt lime followed it. In taverns, her name was spoken only with a toast or a shiver. One curious event revived her legend briefly. In 1874, a collector from Baltimore named Dr. Alaric Boone visited the area in search of early colonial artifacts. His diary, later published by his nephew, records that he found a small brass locket in the marsh bearing the initials E.C. Inside was a scrap of parchment covered in faded ink. The ground remembers all. Boone noted that when he took the locket to his lodgings that night, it emitted a faint metallic odor, like struck coin after rain. He sold it months later to a museum in Philadelphia, where it soon vanished from inventory. Around the same time, a storm unearthed portions of brick foundation near Widow's Hollow. The remains of the chimney were briefly visible again before collapsing into the tide. Some locals claimed to see a glint beneath the mud, iron perhaps, or something stranger. When an attempt was made to excavate the area, the marsh flooded in a single night, swallowing the effort whole. The foreman reported, "Ground too soft for tools. Feels hollow beneath." It was during this period that an historian from Annapolis compiled the earliest written summary of the case, citing both oral accounts and newspaper clippings. In his preface, he compared Carrington's story to the better-documented slave trader Patty Cannon, whose operations across Maryland and Delaware had shocked the nation decades earlier. He wrote, "Carrington was of the same breed, a predator born of profit and impunity. But unlike Cannon, she left no gallows behind, only an echo." By the end of the century, nothing of her property remained. Only the marsh, ever shifting, seemed to breathe where she once stood. Locals said that on certain nights, when the tide retreated, the mud gave off small bubbles that popped with sounds like whispered names. By the 1880s, the Maryland coast had changed. Railways now traced the once isolated shoreline, and new towns rose where marshland had swallowed the past. Yet even among the post-war settlers, the legend of Eliza Carrington persisted like a salt stain that could not be scrubbed away. Travelers stopping at small inns near Cambridge or Easton often heard the same warning: "Don't walk the coast by night. She still trades in souls." In 1883, a visiting journalist named Miriam Coleridge from the Baltimore Gazette undertook a personal investigation into these rumors. Her series, titled Ghosts of the Eastern Shore, appeared in the paper that spring and became a modest sensation among readers. In one column, she wrote, "The story of Widow Carrington is no ghost tale, but a symptom of conscience. The coast cannot forget what it profited from." Coleridge interviewed older residents who still remembered the Carrington name. An aged farmer named Isaac Benning, who claimed his grandfather once sold hay to her, told her that the widow kept ledgers not for crops, but for people. He described how his grandfather once saw her wagons go out full and return empty, yet no money ever crossed hands. When pressed about the graves rumored on her land, Benning shook his head. "The marsh buried her sins for her," he said, "but it never forgave them." Coleridge's articles rekindled public fascination with the story. She even visited Widow's Hollow herself, noting that the air tasted of rust and brine, and that the reeds around the old foundation grew in uneven circles, as though tracing something below. Her guide refused to step closer, claiming he heard chains underfoot. Though Coleridge dismissed it as trick of the tide, her journal entries, discovered after her death, reveal deeper unease. One line reads simply, "I heard tapping in the ground, too regular for water." A year later, the Gazette received a letter from a retired seaman named Abraham Doss, who claimed he once transported goods for Carrington to Norfolk in 1833, the very year she disappeared. His confession, written in trembling hand, described crates that sounded soft inside, like sacks of meal that breathed. When he opened one out of curiosity, he found not merchandise, but cloth and bone. He claimed Eliza paid him in gold and warned him never to speak. The letter ends, "I have carried this sin too long. The sea keeps her, but the shore remembers." No one could verify Doss's claims, yet his words gave new life to the myth. Churches began holding prayer gatherings at the edge of Widow's Hollow. Fishermen nailed small wooden crosses to the old fence posts. But the marsh remained restless. Twice, in 1885 and again in 1889, storms stripped away enough soil to reveal bits of pottery, nails, and what one local paper euphemistically called anatomical fragments. The sheriff dismissed them as animal remains disturbed by erosion, though locals knew better. Around this time, a professor from Johns Hopkins University, studying the history of slavery in Maryland, wrote privately to the Gazette, noting that the Carrington site may represent an undocumented channel in the region's coastal trade network. He never visited the site himself, but remarked that, "My colleagues who have report an inexplicable stillness near the water, as if the air were listening." By century's end, Widow's Hollow was once again deserted, the tides reclaiming its ground. But the legend of the woman who hunted the escaped, and the ground that refused to forget her, had taken on a life stronger than any record. By the dawn of the 1890s, the Carrington story had slipped from newspapers into folklore, told by lamplight to children who no longer believed in ghosts but still feared the marsh. Yet now and then the past reached upward, as though the ground itself wanted its history retold. In 1892, construction began on a small coastal warehouse near Widow's Hollow. The company, hoping to capitalize on crab and oyster shipping routes, laid its foundation on what locals warned was cursed soil. During excavation, workers struck an unusual layer of stone, not natural to the marshlands. Beneath it lay fragments of timber, a rusted hinge, and a half-decayed iron ring set into a square of old brick. The foreman, Robert Hanlon, noted in his logbook, "Old cellar or storage pit. Distinct smell of lime. Possible remains of structure predating war." The next day, one of the laborers refused to return to work, claiming he heard knocking beneath the earth. When Hanlon threatened dismissal, the man replied, "You can fire me, but you can't bury me twice." Within a week, 3 others quit. The site was abandoned before completion, and the company quietly shifted operations upriver. The incident reached the ears of Professor Lionel Parr, a historian who had recently published a study on the Maryland slave trade's coastal logistics, referencing earlier material from the history of slavery in Maryland. Parr obtained Hanlon's notes and traveled to the site that autumn. He found only shallow pools and reeds, but his later paper mentioned brickwork of deliberate design, possibly associated with slaveholding infrastructure. He added cautiously, "Local testimony connects the structure to one Eliza Carrington, a female trader active circa 1828 to 1833, though evidence remains circumstantial." The academic phrasing did little to dispel superstition. That winter, Parr fell ill after a second visit. In a letter to a colleague, he confessed that he had heard a rhythmic echo beneath the surface, like distant hammering. He died within months of pneumonia, and his students, fearful of further curse, destroyed his remaining notes. Around the same time, fishermen reported that the hollow emitted a faint glow on overcast nights. One described it as a lantern's reflection where no lantern could be. The phenomenon was so consistent that a local pastor organized nightly vigils, insisting it was the light of the condemned seeking rest. Others believed it was phosphorus from decaying matter under the marsh water. By 1896, the area was officially marked on coastal maps as Carrington Inlet, a name that appeared without state authorization but persisted on maritime charts for decades. Travelers along the coast noticed their compasses waver when passing the inlet. Boatmen claimed that oars dipped heavier in that stretch of water, as though the tide itself resisted intrusion. One local tale, recorded by a schoolteacher in 1898, described how every few years a small wooden crate washed ashore during storms. Inside were always bones, never the same size, never intact. Children dared each other to open them, and parents warned, "She still trades, even from the deep." By century's end, the Maryland coast was dotted with new towns, rail bridges, and canneries, yet no one built again on Widow's Hollow. Its name remained a cautionary whisper, passed down through families who knew that the past did not disappear. It simply sank. And beneath the surface, where the tides whispered through old stones and salt, the ground still seemed to breathe. As the new century began, the Carrington story slipped into a strange half-life between history and myth. By 1902, Maryland's newspapers treated it as folklore, a curiosity alongside stories of pirate gold and haunted lighthouses. Yet in small coastal towns, the locals didn't laugh. To them, the hollow remained a wound that never closed. That same year, a newly formed preservation group called the Chesapeake Antiquarian Society began cataloging lost estates along the shore. Among the properties listed was Carrington Farm, location uncertain, deeds incomplete. Their archivist, Mrs. Harriet Bloom, visited the area in late summer to gather oral testimony. Her field diary, stored today in the Maryland Historical Society, records a haunting encounter. She interviewed an elderly black woman named Ruth Taylor, whose grandmother had been enslaved on a nearby plantation and once worked under Eliza Carrington's supervision. Ruth's recollection was hesitant, but detailed. The missus carried herself proud, but she had no master's house behind her. She'd buy the runaways. Then the next morning, they'd be gone. Said they were sent south, but nobody saw no wagon go out. At night, the air would burn sweet, like sugar and iron. Ruth also recalled her grandmother's warning. When the widow's lamp burns blue, the river runs backward. Mrs. Bloom noted these accounts carefully, but concluded her diary entry with a chilling remark. At dusk, a smell of lime drifted over the marsh, though no kiln stands within miles. Her report revived brief interest among historians. A follow-up expedition from Baltimore attempted to locate the old Carrington Foundation using magnetic instruments. Though they found nothing visible, their compasses wavered erratically whenever they crossed the hollow. The lead researcher remarked in his report, "The readings fluctuate at 7-second intervals, suggesting underground resonance." The phrase drew ridicule from his peers and was quietly struck from the published version. Meanwhile, local fishermen kept their distance. They told of hearing chain sounds under the tide, like anchors scraping stone, though no ships lay nearby. On moonless nights, the inlet gleamed faintly, a slick blue light moving just beneath the surface. Some swore it marked the outline of her old house. In 1904, tragedy returned. A young man named Daniel Pike, descended from one of the farmers who had once searched her land, vanished while fishing the hollow at night. His boat drifted ashore at dawn, nets intact, lanterns still lit. The only oddity, his oars were placed neatly inside the boat, and his boots were missing. Locals buried an empty coffin for him beside the church, the first burial in decades, to mention the Carrington name in prayer. Shortly afterward, a storm hit the coast, tearing away part of the shoreline. In the exposed mud, children found what appeared to be a rusted hinge and fragments of brick. Their teacher, visiting the site the next day, reported that the hinge smelled of sulfur and oil, as if freshly forged. The tide reclaimed it before she could bring others to see. The following spring, newspapers once again printed the name Widow Carrington, this time in jest, calling her Maryland's answer to Patty Cannon. But in the region itself, the laughter faded quickly. Travelers said that as the trains passed near the coast at night, a faint rhythmic sound rose from the marshes like the slow beating of a buried drum. And the older residents would nod silently, saying only, "She's counting her trades again." By 1908, Widow's Hollow had become an unmarked patch on state maps, left deliberately blank. Surveyors blamed shifting tides and unstable ground, yet even they admitted their instruments failed when brought too close. "The compass trembles like a fever," one wrote, "and the marsh beneath feels hollow, as if some great bell lies buried there." That same year, the Cambridge Chronicle ran an unusual story, a front-page article titled "Bones on the Tide." Fishermen had discovered fragments of human remains tangled in crab nets near Carrington Inlet. The bones were brittle but unmistakably human, some charred, some showing cuts too clean for natural wear. The sheriff collected them and sent them to Baltimore for analysis, but the bones disappeared en route. A replacement report stamped filed and closed, claimed they were animal. The paper never printed a retraction, only a cryptic follow-up line a week later. The shore remembers what the court forgets. Among those who read the story was a young writer named Jonas Merriweather, a schoolteacher with a fascination for Maryland folklore. In 1910, he published a slim volume titled The Widow of the Coast, a study in fear and folklore. His tone was academic, yet the deeper one read, the more his research blurred into obsession. Merriweather described visiting Widow's Hollow and hearing a faint, steady sound underfoot, as though the earth itself were exhaling. He interviewed descendants of families who had lived near Eliza Carrington's land. One man, Samuel Bass, recounted how his grandfather once claimed to have helped dig trenches for her, pits lined with oyster shell and lime, wide as graves. Bass said his grandfather refused to speak of what was buried there, but kept a single coin, allegedly payment from the widow herself. When Merriweather asked to see it, Bass handed him a corroded piece of brass, faintly stem, ped with a spiral. Merriweather described holding the coin during a coastal thunderstorm, feeling it vibrate faintly in his hand. He later confessed in his notes that he began hearing rhythmic tapping afterward, even when inland. The tapping always came in threes. In the closing pages of his book, Merriweather concluded that Eliza Carrington had become a symbol of collective guilt, her legend feeding on the state's unacknowledged history. Yet in the margin of his personal copy, found decades later, he scrawled a final question. If guilt, why does it breathe? After the book's publication, Merriweather vanished during a solo trip back to the coast in 1911. His belongings, notebook, coat, and brass coin, were found neatly folded on a rock near the waterline. Locals said his lantern was seen drifting across the inlet that night, moving steadily toward the horizon before fading under the tide. In the years that followed, his book became a rarity, withdrawn from libraries after complaints from families named in it. Only a handful of copies survive, their margins annotated by readers who swore they too heard faint knocks while reading late at night. By the 1920s, the state dredged part of the marsh to build a narrow service canal. Workers unearthed bricks blackened by fire and fragments of glass shaped like lantern panes. The foreman, asked to describe the smell, said only, "Like rain on metal that's still warm." Even then, no one spoke her name aloud. They simply called that stretch of coast the Widow's Cut, and when storms came in from the Chesapeake, they said the wind there didn't howl. It sighed. By 1925, Widow's Hollow had all but disappeared from the living map of Maryland. The bay had eaten the land in slow bites, leaving a slick gray channel that shimmered oddly at dusk. Locals still refused to fish there, claiming the catch tasted like iron. The area's few remaining elders said the inlet still marked the old Carrington property line, though its soil now lay beneath 10 feet of water. That year, a team from the Maryland Historical Society conducted a survey of lost coastal estates. Among the volunteers was a graduate student named Alice Redfern, who later became the first person in nearly a century to document physical traces of the Carrington story. Her field notes, recovered decades later, record her impressions in a tone both curious and unsettled. The air is stiller here than elsewhere along the bay. Even the birds avoid flying low. We found fragments of blackened brick and a corroded ring embedded in clay. The ring vibrates when touched, faintly, like it holds some leftover memory of sound. Redfern's report also mentions discovering a small patch of higher ground with oddly uniform depressions spaced in rows, as if graves had been pressed flat by time. Beneath one, she and her team found remnants of cloth. The color was indeterminate, though her notes describe traces of human shape in the soil, like a figure that never fully left. When Redfern submitted her findings, Her supervisor insisted on omitting the more sensational details. The official publication listed the site simply as probable 19th century holding facility for maritime trade, with no mention of Carrington. Yet her private journal tells another story. She writes of hearing voices in the wind, indistinct yet rhythmic, and of waking one night to the sound of faint hammering, like someone striking metal deep under the ground. Weeks later, a colleague found her sitting at her desk after hours, staring blankly at a coastal map. She had drawn small spiral symbols across the shoreline, dozens of them, each connected by faint pencil lines converging at Widow's Hollow. When asked about them, she said quietly, "She drew these too. They don't end, they turn inward." Shortly after that, Redfern abandoned her research and left Maryland. In a letter to a friend years later, she admitted, "The soil there doesn't hold bodies. It holds memory. When you stand on it, it remembers you back." Meanwhile, stories from local fishermen persisted. They spoke of lights seen beneath the water, not reflections, but orbs moving slowly, sometimes forming a line before vanishing all at once. Engineers who inspected the new canal pumps complained of mechanical failures whenever they passed that section of coast. One reported that the machinery groaned as if resisting. By the 1930s, the inlet had fully merged with the bay, erasing any visible trace of the old farm. But the absence made the legend sharper. Residents began calling that stretch of coast Carrington's Breath. Travelers claimed they could hear faint gasps rising from the surface on still nights. Not the wind, but something deeper. And yet, even as the shoreline changed, the story never quite died. The historians dismissed it. The workers avoided it. But the tide, rolling in and out, seemed to carry her rhythm still. Slow, deliberate, and unbroken. By 1932, Maryland's eastern shore was quieter than ever, its marshlands reclaimed by water and reeds, its older towns thinning into ghostly silence after decades of industrial decline. But the name Carrington surfaced again that summer when government engineers began surveying the coast for a new radio relay station. Their site, chosen for its isolation and direct line across the bay, fell just beyond the old boundaries of Widow's Hollow. One of the engineers, Thomas Greaves, kept meticulous daily logs, later archived at the Naval Engineering Museum. In his entry, dated August 14th, he describes how their equipment began malfunctioning. All instruments show intermittent static, occurring in exact intervals of 7 seconds. When calibrated elsewhere, no error. Source localized near Marsh Channel. No visible wires or magnetics present. Greaves dismissed the anomaly as a geological quirk, perhaps deposits of iron or underground gas. But his assistant, a local man named Henry Doss, refused to remain on site after dusk. Doss told him the rhythm matched the widow's calling, a phrase Greaves later underlined 3 times in his notes. Within days, the team reported additional disturbances. Radio transmissions, normally crisp, filled with a soft crackling that rose and fell like measured breathing. Several men claimed the static carried a faint voice, female, but indistinct. One wrote, "Could swear it said my name, though I heard it through the ground, not the air." By early September, the project was halted. Heavy fog rolled in, and the marsh became impassable. A memorandum sent to Washington cited magnetic interference and unreliable topography. Privately, Greaves admitted in a letter to his wife that the fog carried a metallic taste, like something burnt long ago. That winter, storms stripped away a section of the newly dredged canal nearby, exposing part of a sarcophagus, tone foundation. Surveyors documented the site but left quickly, noting the air temperature around the stones was several degrees warmer than the surrounding marsh. The discovery was filed under Submerged 19th century remains unclassified. One of the younger engineers, curious about the legend, began collecting local stories. He visited an elderly boatman in Cambridge who recounted his grandfather's tale of the woman who sold and slaughtered the escaped. The old man described her house as a forge that burned with no smoke, and her voice as a hum that never stopped. When asked if he believed she truly existed, the boatman nodded. "She ain't gone," he said. "She's just deeper now." In 1934, a last attempt was made to stabilize the shoreline near Carrington's Breath. Workers driving pylons into the mud reported the ground fighting back as if striking something solid beneath. When one pylon finally sank, a plume of bubbles erupted from the surface, releasing a foul odor of iron and ash. The foreman ordered the site abandoned by dusk. From that year forward, the area was officially marked unsuitable for development. Yet fishermen still avoided its waters. They said nets caught there came up torn, as if sliced from below. And sometimes, they claimed, the lines would tighten suddenly, as though something heavy, but unseen, was pulling them gently back toward the deep. Even now, old tide tables record that the currents around Widow's Hollow shift slightly every 7th second, steady, precise, almost deliberate. Scientists call it coincidence. The locals call it what it has always been, the widow's counting. By the late 1930s, the legend of Widow Carrington had become a regional secret again. A story told only when the lamps were low and the bay lay still. The new generation of coastal residents no longer feared the past as their grandparents did, but they spoke carefully about Carrington's Breath, avoiding the inlet after dark. Yet a new kind of curiosity was rising, academic and technological. In 1938, a group of students from the University of Maryland's Anthropology Department launched a small expedition to document coastal superstition and its environmental origins. Their faculty advisor, Dr. Martin H. Crane, hoped to demonstrate that the Carrington myth was rooted in natural phenomena, decaying organic gases, echoing tides, and magnetic silt. Crane's report, however, never reached publication. Only fragments remain in the university's archives, and the most complete version came from one surviving field notebook. It begins with optimism, descriptions of clear weather, detailed sketches of shoreline strata. But by the third entry, the tone changes. Compass disrupted again, all 4 needles spinning counter to each other. Every instrument affected the same way, even pocket watches. Air very still. One student reports rhythmic sound like hammering underwater, not wind, not birds. 2 days later, the group reported that one of their divers, Walter Reeve, failed to surface during a shallow water inspection. The area was barely 6 feet deep. His air hose, retrieved intact, had been cleanly severed. Not torn, but sliced. The coroner called it a boating accident, though no propeller marks were found, and no boats had been logged within 10 miles that day. Dr. Crane stayed in the area for 3 more nights, hoping to recover Reeve's equipment. In his final notebook entry, he described a pulsing light beneath the surface. Not lightning, not reflection, but a low vibration that made the water tremble, as if something beneath were breathing. That page ends abruptly, mid-sentence. When rescue teams arrived the next week, they found the expedition's tents abandoned. Crane's personal effects, notebooks, lantern, and camera, were neatly arranged inside his tent. His boots stood by the water's edge, dry. The rest of the team was gone. The university quietly dissolved the study. Newspapers printed a small article about the missing men, but avoided the Carrington name altogether, calling the tragedy a coastal misadventure. Privately, the case became an obsession for a handful of researchers who believed the inlet's magnetic anomalies were linked to underground mineral deposits or decaying iron from shipwrecks. But among locals, the story returned to its older shape. They said the widow had reclaimed those who disturbed her sleep. Some insisted that during storms that autumn, lights could be seen moving beneath the bay, tracing faint circles in the water, just as her house once stood in rings of stone. When the war came in the 1940s, military patrols began using that stretch of coast for training flights. Pilots occasionally reported compass failure or instrument drift near Carrington's Breath. One logbook entry from a 1943 reconnaissance plane reads, "Magnetic interference over coastal marsh sector. Visibility clear. Sea appears luminous. Concentric light rings visible under surface. Faded before approach." The officer commanding the flight dismissed it as phosphorescent algae, but another crewman, a Maryland native, muttered afterward, "She's drawing circles again." Even in the age of engines and steel, the old rhythm persisted, a heartbeat underwater, steady as the tide. By 1945, the war had ended, but the coast remained uneasy. Fishermen returning to the Chesapeake found their nets snagged in strange ways near the old inlet, as though caught on something rigid beneath the silt. A few brought up fragments of brick and glass, curved like lantern lenses, glinting faintly, even after decades underwater. The state called them relics of antebellum structures, yet the divers swore they were newly scorched, still carrying the smell of ash. That same year, a naval research team stationed in Annapolis recorded unexplained sonar interference along the lower Maryland coastline. The report, now declassified, identifies one particular zone of disturbance, Sector 9A, Carrington's Breath. The sonar logs describe rhythmic pulses echoing through the water column, repeating every 7 seconds. Each pulse carried a faint harmonic distortion, almost tonal. The team's notes mention it resembled human vocal range, low frequency, indeterminate language. The Navy blamed the readings on mechanical echo or subsurface gas release. But a technician, Lieutenant Harold Ellis, wrote in his personal diary, "We played the sonar tape through a loudspeaker. The pattern sounds deliberate. One man said it spoke a word, 'Here.' Another thought it was laughter." Ellis requested a return mission later that year, but was reassigned before it occurred. In a letter to his wife, he warned, "If I'm sent back to that inlet, I'll walk home first. The place listens when you talk." Meanwhile, the locals who had once kept their distance began reporting renewed disturbances. In 1947, 2 brothers clamming near the marsh heard chains dragging through shallow water, though the tide was low and clear. When they investigated, the sound stopped, replaced by the slow, rhythmic knocking many had described before. "Like someone building a coffin underwater," one said later. Around the same time, construction began on a small highway stretching across the coastal plain. During excavation, workers uncovered a patch of packed clay that broke apart in geometric shapes, rectangles, as if molded by hands. Beneath the layer were shards of pottery and a rusted ring of iron set into the earth. The foreman ordered the trench refilled, muttering, "She's still under contract." A journalist from the Baltimore Evening Sun, researching post-war ghost stories, visited the coast to write about the widow. His article, "The Woman Who Never Stopped Counting," appeared in November 1948. He treated the story with a mix of skepticism and fascination, connecting it to earlier figures like Patty Cannon, whose crimes along the Delaware-Maryland border had long haunted public imagination. He suggested Carrington was a local variant of the same cruelty, reborn through guilt and soil. The article revived attention briefly, drawing small waves of tourists to the region. A few came to fish, others simply to stand by the rail overlooking the bay. Many left quickly. They complained that the air near the inlet felt charged, like before lightning, and that the sound of waves carried an unnatural rhythm, a soft pulse that seemed to sync with their own heartbeat. By the decade's end, storms once again reshaped the shoreline. The last remnant of the old marsh road disappeared beneath the sea, and the state removed Widow's Hollow from official coastal maps. Yet to sailors navigating those waters, the inlet still marked a point of quiet dread. Compasses quivered there, radios hissed, and sometimes, just before dawn, the tide would flatten perfectly, as though something below had drawn in a long, patient breath, waiting to exhale. By 1950, the Carrington legend had returned full circle, from whispered folklore to uneasy documentation. Scientific curiosity once again reached the Maryland coast, this time under the guise of progress. The U.S. Geological Survey commissioned new sonar readings along the Chesapeake shoreline to prepare for coastal dredging and infrastructure expansion. One of the chosen zones, noted simply as Subsector 9A, unstable sediment, encompassed the remains of Widow's Hollow. The lead geophysicist, Dr. Leonard Morrow, a pragmatic man of modern science, dismissed the old tales as cultural residue of pre-industrial guilt. Yet even he found the data inexplicable. His 1951 field log, later acquired by the Smithsonian, contains a short, unsettling note. Interference persists. Pulses measure precisely 7-second intervals. Sound amplitude resembles rhythmic respiration, unrelated to machinery. Origin unclear. His assistant, Emily Dorr, wrote in her own notes that their instruments would shut off for a full 7 seconds every hour, always beginning at the exact moment the pulse peaked. She added, "We cannot record the silence. The machines refuse it." Locals refused to assist the team, warning that the tide keeps her bargains. Still, Morrow persisted. In late April, his crew dropped weighted microphones into the inlet. The recordings captured faint vibrations, first like a deep hum, then, unmistakably, like the dragging of metal through silt. On playback, Dorr noticed something stranger. The hum occasionally rose into a faint human frequency, low, steady, nearly a whisper. When she amplified the sound, she swore it formed 3 syllables. "Still counting me." The tapes were confiscated 2 days later under the order of a regional naval office. Officially, the study was classified as terminated due to environmental hazards. Morrow never spoke publicly about the incident, though in a private letter to a colleague, he wrote, "The hollow has structure, not randomness. It is engineered. By whom or what I cannot say." After the survey ended, the coast was closed to further exploration. But in the nearby town of Oxford, residents began noticing subtle changes. The church clock, newly repaired, would pause inexplicably every 7 seconds before resuming. Wells near the shore produced water that smelled faintly metallic. Some said it tasted of salt and smoke. That same summer, a fisherman named Jonah Pike, descendant of one of the men who had searched Carrington's house a century before, vanished at sea. His last entry in a weathered journal, later found floating in his overturned skiff, read, "The tide turned twice today. I saw her light again, moving under the water like a lantern. She's waiting for the count to finish." Authorities dismissed it as delusion brought on by fatigue, but 2 nights after his disappearance, coastal residents reported blue flashes beneath the bay, short rhythmic bursts that rose and fell like breathing. The Coast Guard searched for electrical discharge or wreckage. They found none. By the end of 1951, the shoreline near Carrington's Breath was once again declared environmentally unstable. It was fenced off and left to erosion. And yet the pulse persisted. Those who lived closest claimed it grew stronger during storms, rattling their windows like a heartbeat against the wind. It was as though the widow had adapted, her trade no longer in flesh or coin, but in the memory of motion, the constant turning of tide and time. Her rhythm, steady as ever, kept the coast alive with a breath that refused to die. By 1953, the Maryland coast had become a place of measured modernity, mapped, industrialized, and catalogued by science. Yet for all the progress, there remained one space on the charts marked in pale gray: Carrington's Breath. It was labeled non-navigable water, though local boatmen said that wasn't true. They simply refused to pass it. That year, a small team from the Army Corps of Engineers conducted a final assessment of the inlet's suitability for dredging. Among them was a young hydrologist named Dr. Peter Lang, who would later admit that he accepted the assignment to prove the widow's legend false. His early notes are professional: tides, salinity, barometric readings. But midway through the log, the language shifts, increasingly personal, almost confessional. We lowered the sonar array at Euro 900. No return pattern consistent with the bottom contour. Sounded again at 0910. The echo repeated itself 7 seconds later without transmission. The signal came back before we sent it. Lang recalibrated the device 3 times. Each time, the same thing occurred: a returning pulse that anticipated their signal. He described it as the water replying before being addressed. When he replayed the recordings, the pulse pattern formed faint intervals of rising tone, what his technician compared to the opening bars of a hymn. They laughed at first, until the tone repeated itself perfectly every 70 seconds, growing slightly louder each time. That night, Lang stayed on the barge after the others had gone to sleep. He recorded an audio diary. On the surviving reel, his voice grows hushed. It isn't mechanical, it's memory. The ground here remembers vibration the way an ear remembers sound. The pulse, it's breathing through the instruments. By dawn, the barge was found drifting half a mile off course. Its anchor lines snapped clean. The crew was safe, except for Lang, who was discovered collapsed near the console. He survived, but when he regained consciousness, he refused to speak of the inlet again. His later interviews are terse. Only one remark stands out: she's still keeping count. Following that incident, the Corps declared Carrington's Breath permanently off-limits for all navigation and study. A buoy was anchored near the site, flashing a warning every 7 seconds. It remains there today. Locals soon began claiming the buoy itself moved. Fishermen swore it drifted inward at night and returned by morning, though its mooring was steel and concrete. They also reported that the flashing sometimes synchronized with lightning during storms, blue against blue, timed too precisely to be chance. By the mid-1950s, legends circulated again. Children claimed that if you stood on the cliffs above the inlet and counted to 7 aloud, the wind would pause before answering. Others said the marsh sometimes whispered numbers when the tide rose. In 1956, a final government report quietly referenced the region, describing repeating low-frequency oscillations in submerged sediment layers, classifying them as non-threatening but perpetual. The final line reads, "unlikely to cease within human time frame." That phrase, "within human time frame," became the closest thing to an epitaph for Eliza Carrington. Her crimes, her land, her victims, all absorbed by time. But her rhythm remained, locked in the bones of the bay, unbroken and still counting. Even now, the coast holds its breath between those intervals, 7 seconds of silence before the next pulse returns. By 1958, the inlet had turned into a restricted zone, marked on naval maps as simply Area 7S. The buoy still blinked, steady as a metronome, warning away anyone curious enough to drift too near. From the cliffs above, it looked harmless, a quiet stretch of water, pale and still. Yet for those who lived within earshot, it was never silent. Local residents began reporting a peculiar phenomenon. Their household clocks would desynchronize when storms passed over Carrington's Breath. Some lost time, others gained it, never by much, always by 7 seconds. The power company blamed magnetic interference from submerged metal, but the locals didn't need an explanation. They said, "That's just her keeping the books right." In March 1959, a documentary filmmaker named Edwin Holt arrived from Washington to record haunted coastlines for a public broadcast. He interviewed the few surviving families whose ancestors had lived near the Carrington property. One elderly man, John Pike, the last descendant of the line that had once searched her home, told him plainly, "She was real, sir. She's not a ghost. She's the tide." Holt's field notes show growing unease as his production continued. The sound engineers reported unexplained low hums on their audio reels, precisely every 7 seconds. One technician claimed he could hear a woman's sigh in the distortion. The crew dismissed it as wind until the playback equipment caught the hum even indoors, miles from the shore. That night, Holt and his cameraman decided to film the inlet under a full moon. The footage, fragments of which survive in the Maryland State Archive, shows a calm sea for the first few minutes. Then, faint ripples begin forming concentric rings across the surface, perfectly circular, spreading from a point near the buoy. The cameraman can be heard muttering, "That's not wind. That's breathing." The film ends abruptly. The final frame captures a faint reflection, not a face, not light, but the suggestion of a figure rising beneath the water, indistinct yet human in proportion. When the crew returned the next morning, the buoy was gone. It was later found 2 miles inland, resting upright in a cornfield. The documentary was never aired. Holt returned to Washington and withdrew from film entirely. In a letter to his editor, he wrote, "I've learned that history doesn't die when you bury it. Sometimes it waits to be exhaled." Soon after, locals claimed to see new blue lights flickering under the inlet, faint but rhythmic. Some believed it was the buoy's reflection. Others said it was her lantern. The fishermen who still braved the bay refused to count the seconds between flashes. "If you count with her," one warned, "she learns your number." By the end of that year, storms swept the coast again. The tide rose high enough to swallow half the cliffs, erasing the last visible trace of Widow's Hollow. But in its place, the sea began to move differently, slower, deeper, almost deliberate. And when the wind quieted, those who listened said they could still hear the Widow of the Coast, not in voice, but in motion, as if her counting had become the sea's heartbeat itself. By 1960, the state officially sealed Carrington's Breath from all civilian access. The coast was fenced, the buoy removed, and maps redrawn, so the inlet seemed never to have existed, yet even erased, it continued to be felt. Fishermen said their compasses still trembled when passing the new boundary. The Coast Guard, though silent in public, admitted privately that their depth sounders returned echoes where no floor should be. That winter, a final incident was recorded, one that closed the file for good. On January 11, 1960, 3 maintenance workers inspecting coastal telegraph lines near the cliffs reported hearing a faint, repetitive tone through their equipment, 7 seconds apart, like a coded signal. They followed the sound to the edge of the bay. The oldest of the men, William Harlan, swore the water below was rising and falling like a living chest. They left before dusk, shaken. 2 days later, Harlan returned alone. His truck was found still running on the road, headlights facing the inlet. His boots were at the edge of the cliff. The report filed afterward used the same phrase as a century before: presumed drowned. But divers sent to search the cove found no trace, no body, no boots, not even footprints. They did, however, note something strange. The sediment below the waterline was unusually compact, as if pressed by steady weight from beneath. After that, the state closed the area permanently. No further studies, no articles, no official acknowledgement. The land gave itself back to the tide, and the story returned to silence. But silence on the Maryland coast has never meant peace. For the residents who remain near the old boundary, the legend still lives, retold in whispers by lantern light. They say the tide near the cliffs doesn't follow the moon. It moves by its own rhythm, 7 seconds in, 7 seconds out, as though obeying a burr it command. Some nights, when fog rolls in thick from the Chesapeake, the air itself begins to pulse, so faint it could be mistaken for breath. Lights appear under the surface, blue, soft, measured. And those who dare to count between them, to match the rhythm, say the same thing happens every time. The last pulse never comes. The water holds its breath, waiting. Whether it's tide, magnetism, or the remnants of something buried too deep to name, no one can say. But the old families still mark the nights when the wind dies for 7 seconds and the bay goes still. They say that's when Eliza Carrington is closest, not as a ghost, but as a habit the land refuses to forget. A rhythm older than law, older than forgiveness. And somewhere beneath that dark water, beneath layers of lime and bone and mud, the ground still beats its pulse, steady, patient, counting. 7 seconds. Always 7. The Maryland coast breathes with her still,